If you think back long ago, there was a famous TV program that appeared in the mid-50s. It was entitled Candid Camera, and some of you remember it. The idea was that they could catch people as they really were, and sometimes they would require people to do unusual things. Once they had set up in a grocery store that had tiles, black and white, and it says, "Please only step on the white tiles." And people are hopping around like little birds trying to fulfill that. And I remember another time that in a bowling alley, they filled up the bowling pins. Well, they were made out of glass instead of wood, and they were filled with milk. And so they show this one bowler coming down with this ball, and he lunges it down the alley, and it goes right down the middle. It looks like he's going to get a strike and smash. All these pieces of glass go in a million pieces, go flying in every direction, and milk splattered all over. And they capture the look on the person's face, the bowler, who's in total shock, because he's destroyed the pins. Didn't understand that. My favorite was they had come up with a vehicle, a VW Beetle, that was driven by two people. And the car could split in half and then come back together again and snap together. And in Binghamton, they went to the main downtown square where the police were directing traffic. And here comes the Beetle, and it's moving down the road, and the policeman puts up his arm like that to stop, and he sees the thing split in half and go around him. He could have just about swallowed the whistle that he had. Couldn't believe it. Anyway, it was an entertaining program, and it would catch people as they were. Now, the surveillance that has been developed since that time is far more sophisticated. And today, the candid cameras are very different. If you go into a convenience store, you're on candid camera. If you go into a mall, a government building, a hospital, you're on candid camera. I can remember 25 years ago, an account that I had. This proprietor of 5 different cleaning stores says, "Hey, you want to see something neat? I just got this," he said. And it was a smartphone or the equivalent, and it had pictures of all 5 stores, and you could see the cash register in each of the 5. And so he said, "I can keep track of my employees to see if they're stealing or if they're honest or whatever." This is way back then. And so he had this little pocket item that contained all of that. And it was an absolute marvel to the rest of us looking at that kind of technology occurred. Well, there's a lot more developed today. If you remember a couple years ago, there were 2 brothers that for political reasons tried to sabotage the Boston Marathon. They thought they were anonymous. They thought they could create an explosion and get away. As it turned out, there was so much videotape on them as they worked their way up to the end of the race, and they were walking on different sidewalks. But all the sidewalks in that city, or in so many other cities, have constant camera surveillance. It's the world we live in. But that is nothing compared to the surveillance system that God has, because God sees everything. He sees every detail of everything. And sometimes it's easy to forget that. We just take life for granted, we move along. Not that we should have anything to hide, but God is very much aware of what we do, what we think, what others do, what they think, where they are. God is watching everywhere. And sometimes we don't realize the extent of that. I would like us to turn over to Proverbs 15. Proverbs 15, and we'll pick it up in, verse 3. Proverbs 15. And it says, "The Lord is watching everywhere." I'm reading from the New Living Translation. I have a King James. I inadvertently left that at home. So we'll go with the NLT here. chapter 15, verse 3, the Lord is watching everywhere, keeping his eye on both the good and the evil. Now, just because he doesn't instantly intervene when some evil occurs doesn't mean that he's not aware of it or that he doesn't care. He does care. This is important. And along with that, we can add 2 Chronicles 16. 2 Chronicles chapter 16. In verse 9. 2 Chronicles 16 and verse 9. It says, well, 1 Chronicles 2. Verse 9, and we read, the eyes of the Lord search the whole earth in order to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. He has constantly been dedicated to paying attention to everything that goes on in this world. And it's important. I mean, it doesn't say in the prophecies that unless those days are shortened, no flesh will be saved alive. Just that would be a reason to want God to be in constant surveillance to make sure that that doesn't happen. There are so many different reasons for God to keep track of things. One of the reasons, not the primary subject, but in passing, one of the important things that God has to do is to monitor the direction of Bible prophecy. It's to make sure that things don't happen out of sequence, that God's sequence. He has to know what's going on to be able to monitor it, and also to make sure that the things that were predicted to happen do unfold exactly the way they were predicted. So God must monitor all the affairs of mankind in order to know that. Another important aspect, God has to make sure that he knows the extent of what activity Satan tries to do. He has to be able to restrict Satan from doing any more or any less than he would want. He can utilize Satan to harass human beings or to create trials for them. Satan only does what God allows. And God will give him more latitude to do more in the future in order to allow the society to be deceived. Better it to be deceived than to know exactly what's right and wrong and refuse to do it. So anyway, God has to, yes, keep track of the different events that fulfill Bible prophecy, but he also has to know what extent Satan is active and where he is. So that's important. And then what is my focus today is that God wants a perfect surveillance system to evaluate human beings, to know how to reward them according to their works. There are many places in the Bible that talks about that. Revelation 22:12. We'll look at that later, but that talks a great deal about the fact that God has to know what people are doing in order to give them the appropriate reward. So that is my focus today, is to analyze just how significant is that God has a surveillance system among the saints of God. As it says in 1 Peter, judgment is beginning on the house of God. And when I say judgment, there are different, the context of a Bible verse will tell you what the word judgment means. In some cases, somebody could say, well, my judgment is, my decision is. You see that in Acts 15 with the Apostle James. Then there are times where judgment, yes, as a verdict, it's a decree. Other times, judgment is evaluation over a period of time. There are such things as horse shows or other shows with animals on exhibition, dog shows, where maybe a particular pet or a particular horse is given 2 minutes in front of judges to be evaluated on how well it canters, whether it jumped gracefully over the various obstacles. So the judges will render a score. In the Olympics, the same thing with the ice skaters. This one got a 5.6. Another person skated, earned a 6.0 score, which is the highest. So when you have evaluation over a period of time, that can be also called judgment. With that in mind, we go over to 1 Peter chapter 4. 1 Peter 4, and we'll see in verse 17. It says, "For the time has come for judgment, and it must begin with God's household." There are several different periods of judgment. Right now, the first period of judgment is on the house of God, on the saints, on us. It's nothing to fear, but God is paying attention to us. He wants to see how we do. He wants to help us. He wants to answer our prayers, guide us. And if we do well, then he says, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Let me give you eternal life. Let me give you different responsibilities. And I know now what responsibilities I want to give you because I've monitored you all of your life, and I see where you've been and see what you've accomplished." So God will do that. He evaluates us, and that is ongoing evaluation until we die or until Christ returns, whichever comes first for us. So you and I cannot ever get away from God's candid cameras. I say that in quotes. He doesn't need a video camera. He can keep track of us very, very easily, and I don't think we possibly can imagine how easily he can. He says he knows the number of hairs on our head. How can that be? He says that he knows the stars by name. That's in Isaiah 47. There are billions. We don't have any idea. They still keep counting. New galaxies discovered by the Hubble telescope. And these are galaxies. Well, how many millions of stars are the newly discovered galaxies each? It's undefined. We know that God is great, but he's greater than what we can even imagine. And he's got names for all these different celestial beings, and he's got the ability to count hairs on people's heads, or know when every bird or sparrow falls to the ground. That's in Matthew 10. That shows phenomenal ability to monitor the human race. That doesn't sound like much of a challenge compared to naming all these different stars on and on. And God is in control of that. It's easy for him to do that and know the thoughts of all of us. It dwarfs the most advanced computers by so much that it's not even worth describing. Now, David didn't even understand this, but King David wrote in Psalm 139, and I find this quite interesting. And so please let us realize that being under the judgment of God is not something to fear. Not if we're trying to obey him as best we can. He knows we make mistakes. He probably knows exactly, to the nth degree, exactly how many mistakes. In my case, maybe it's 5,639 in the last month. I don't know. But God would be able to answer that. He knows us. He knows us inside and out, our comings in and goings out. Psalm 139, here David writes, "O Lord, you've examined my heart, and you know everything about me. You know when I stand up or sit down. You know my thoughts even when I'm far away. You see me when I travel, and when I rest at home, you know everything I do. You know what I'm going to say even before I say it, Lord. You go before me and follow me. You place your hand of blessing on my head. Such knowledge, too wonderful for me, too great for me to understand." Verse 7, "I can never escape your spirit." Now, he didn't ever really want to, but he says, I can't. Even if I tried, I can never get away from your presence. If I go up to heaven, you are there. If I go down to the grave, you are there. If I ride the wings of the morning, if I dwell in the farthest oceans, even there your hand will guide me. Well, that's comforting to know. I mean, what would it be like if we ended up going to some other place in the world and we were told God is simply not here. He doesn't know what's going on here. He has nothing. He's not responsible for anything. And you just stay here at your own risk. That's not the way it works. God is everywhere he needs to be. And he says verse 10, David acknowledges, even if your hand would guide me, your strength will support me. I could ask the darkness to hide me and the light around me to become night, but even in darkness I can't hide from you. To you the night shines as bright as day. Darkness and light are the same to you. You made all the delicate inner parts of my body and knit me together in my mother's womb. Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. He was saying words that are very true, but he doesn't understand just how true they are. Your workmanship is marvelous, how well I know it. You watched me as I was being formed in utter seclusion, as I was woven together in the dark of the womb. It's hard to read verses like that and without concluding that abortion is an abomination to God. You saw me before I was born. Every day of my life was recorded in your book. Life before birth. Every moment was laid out before a single day had passed. How precious are your thoughts about me, O God. They cannot be numbered. I cannot count them. They outnumber the grains of the sand. That's the vibes that David received from God, that numerous. If for him it would be applicable for us. And when I wake up, you are still with me. O God, if you would only destroy the wicked, get out of my life, you murderers. They blaspheme you. Your enemies misuse your name. O Lord, shouldn't I hate those that hate you? Now, he wrestled with this on different occasions, reflected in some of the different psalms that he wrote. But he concludes in verse 23, search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. No, he was a human being. He feared at times. His faith was strong with God, but it wasn't perfect. He was not a perfect person. Point out anything in me that offends you, and lead me along the path of everlasting life. Well, that's a very candid psalm, and he's not trying to escape God, but he knows that he can't. Quite a contrast from Adam and Eve. And once they ate of the wrong tree, then they panicked. They realized, we did wrong. What are we going to do now? I got a great idea. We'll hide from God. Like that's going to solve anything. And another thing, we'll hide from God and we'll wear some leaves. We'll sew those together. And what do we do for food if we're hiding from God? If we come out in the open, they'll see us. Well, we'll just have to go out at night, maybe dig up a few carrots. Does that make sense? Of course not. But they did not have the scope of understanding that David had. So they didn't realize there is no escape. There is no escape. Matthew chapter 10, I've referred to, but I'll turn over there. Matthew 10 and verse 29 and 30. I find this of great comfort. Chapter 10 and verse 29. And we read as follows. 20. No. What is the price of 2 sparrows? Christ asked his disciples. 1 copper coin? But not a single sparrow can fall to the ground without your Father knowing it. And the very hairs on your head are numbered. So do not be afraid for adversity, for are you not more valuable to God than a whole flock of sparrows? Well, the answer obviously is yes. He keeps track of that. I won't say he keeps track of it because of his candid cameras. He just has that ability within himself because he is that brilliant. And it's important, again, to watch and monitor all the affairs of the world, as I've enumerated already, to manage the fulfillment of Bible prophecy, to know how to limit Satan, and to answer our prayers. And no, God does not miss a single prayer. You know, thousands and tens of thousands of prayers come up to him every day at this point. You read about that in Revelation 5 and Revelation 8, that they come to him and they're like a sweet aroma to him. And he knows how many, he can count all the prayers and what everybody says. We can't take that for granted. It would be silly for us to. Now, one thing that I find fascinating is that God is constantly planning and evaluating and examining us because he wants, yes, for us to overcome. He wants to know where to place us, to job places for the world tomorrow. And a lot of that depends on the choices we make between now and the time Christ returns. So he is looking for a team of administrators. That would include us, that would help him monitor the affairs of human beings and be there for the human beings, to help and to teach and to guide them. And we cover this at the Feast of Tabernacles, so many different Bible verses. Isaiah 30, verse 20. This is the way, walk you in it. We'll come up behind people and let them know if they deviate. We'll help steer the human race. And then to gather them out of captivity at the beginning of the millennium. That's in Isaiah 11 and other places. It's going to be an exciting time, a time when people that have lost hope will get hope again. We'll be there to help them. Well, God has to make sure that we are people-oriented, that we are excited about his plan of salvation, that excited about Christ coming back and being the leader of all the people that are in a state of bewilderment. You know, there will be so much chaos in the Great Tribulation that when the dust settles, people will be traumatized. They'll need teams of caring saints to help work with them. And God has to know what the saints need in order to have the tools necessary to be able to, or know how to use tools, know how to rightly divide the word of truth, the Bible, in order to help these people. And I have no doubt that we'll be equipped with the ability to do that. God is so logical as well as idealistic, and he's thought this out probably a million times or more in his head, how he wants his administration to be set up. Now, he could just do it all with his son, Jesus Christ, and they could have, well, they certainly have the angels, and that's not a small group of beings, but he wanted to share that with other human beings, and he wants the human race to continue. All indication, and that the administration of human beings not only continues forever, but it expands forever. With that in mind, let's turn to Isaiah 9 and verse 7, because this is a classic place to go to show that life doesn't just end after Christ returns or 1,000 years after he is here. I think of Gerald Waterhouse giving a sermon once at the Feast of Tabernacles, and it was so appropriate that his point was that it seems like we're just at the beginning of the plan of salvation, and we've got eons of light years ahead of us. And he says it will always seem that way. Even a million years from now, we'll look back and say, yeah, we remember our infancy in Vero Beach, but you know, that was just the beginning of the beginning. Now that we're spirit being, we've got all these other responsibilities, and we've had some interplanetary travel, and we've consulted with God on different occasions, and we've got all this energy now and feel terrific that, wow, there's so much to do, so much to, and he's refined us and worked with us to the point that we are the representatives that are needed for this part of the world, or eventually maybe this part of the universe. Our responsibilities will ever increase. Challenge will always be there. Now, if you've looked at the pastor letter I wrote, it's incredible that about 6 years ago, a group of people decided to raise money and take applications to go to the planet Mars. And they were going to not just get the best astronauts, but get people, they said, with a willing attitude, a willing heart, people that wanted to learn. And the problem was that this was a one-way trip. It's cheaper that way. But it was, I'm serious, you're looking at me, some of you. But it was planned to go to Mars sometime around 2024 and take a handful of people and they would go to colonize it. And then another group would come 2 years later, and then 2 years after that, another rocket ship. And all the while, other people that said, this is insane. This is a suicide mission. It can't get off the ground. There's dangers in just launching a rocket. People that have never done it before? Are you kidding me? And then they're going to fly for 6 months to get to Mars, and then how are they going to land and not damage their ship, and then be able to have the appropriate and necessary buildings and building material to be able to house a handful of people and hope that others come later? And there were a few that said, well, you know what? If it doesn't happen, it's worth it. If I've got a 1 in 100 chance of surviving past the first year, I'm going for it. And some of these people had PhDs. They were well educated. And it pointed out that God has built in man a desire to want to live on, want to conquer the next mountain, want to see what's over the next hill. It's just built in man. And to expand and push against his limits. What's the world record in such and such? Well, let's see if I can't break it. And it's just that nature of man. Well, the blessing on that is that God is going to take that desire and use it for very practical purpose and great purpose, and that is to help fellow humans to be in the God family. Perhaps we'll counsel the people for baptism that are born in the millennium. Not perhaps, I can almost guarantee it. And work with them in so many other areas and encourage them to look forward to when they could have eternal life and help humanity. And if in Isaiah 9, in verse 7, it says, his government and its peace will never end. And he will rule with fairness and justice from the throne of his ancestor David. And in the King James, I think it says, in the increase of his government, there will be no end. If the population stayed the same, you wouldn't have to have an increase in administration. It's like if Vero Beach stays the same, whatever their government structure is now is probably sufficient. But if it doubled in size, you would need 2 dog catchers instead of 1. You might need 3 tax collectors instead of 1. You would need more people to monitor the affairs of the city. And so it would just increase. And if you said the increase of the government in Vero Beach will never, never end, that means it would get bigger and bigger. The population would get larger and larger. So the implication is that God is going to have more responsibility for his saints. And it doesn't spell it out, but the suggestion is this goes on beyond planet Earth. And what did God create these enormous galaxies for if it weren't to share with human beings that would become spirit being and have the bodies in which to go and not take 6 months to get there? So that's in the offing. So God plans to expand his administration, but that depends on all of us being loyal to him, wanting to incorporate, among other things, the virtues of Psalm 15. We heard about that, and other great ideas to make this a beautiful world, and then a world that God can set his throne, move it to the earth, and then expand from there. So God has given human beings the desire to want to push their limits. The trouble is sometimes humans will do that in areas that are very, very dangerous. And putting together a rocket ship to go to Mars without the best minds involved could be very foolish. But God's plan of expansion and sharing and developing human beings is not far-fetched. But he wants us to be fitly framed together. That's important. That means that we work as a team and that we might have different subgroups that work well. Historically, there have been different groups like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They are mentioned often as a package. And we can't prove, but we've wondered, could they in fact be a team? But when it says in 1 Peter 3 and verse 7, it says that, talking about husbands and wives, they're heirs together. It doesn't spell it out necessarily, but there is some possibility that husband and wives may be teams together in the millennium and beyond. So that may make sense in the fact that after marriage we mellow out, hopefully, and we have less rough edges, and we work with a mate that's similar to us maybe, but thinks differently at times. And how well can we adjust and be malleable? And how well at work can we get along with everybody? And how well in other endeavors can we be in harmony with our environment? So these are key abilities. God has to monitor us and steer us so that we can be learning about these things. Let's turn over to Revelation chapter 3. Revelation chapter 3, verse let's go to chapter 2 and verse 26. It says, Revelation 2:26, to all those that are victorious who obey me to the very end, to them will I give authority over the nations, and they will rule the nations with a rod of iron. Yes, but it may not be that often that you would the saints would rule with iron. Most of the time, it's with lovingly pointing out, this is the way. Let's try this. Let's implement all of God's laws. Let's go over to Revelation 3 and verse 21. Revelation 3 and verse 21. Those who are victorious will sit with me on my throne, just as I was victorious and sat with my Father on his throne. That's a wonderful prediction. But the examination doesn't just stop here. It only starts. Because if we consider other things, all right, we're going to sit with God, Jesus Christ, on his throne, next to him, at his throne. And then we'll be working with him. We'll be in close proximity with him and his ideas and his plans. So, for that to happen, God has to monitor how we're doing now and how we do next week. Are we growing spiritually? Are we thinking the way God does? Because if we get to that point, then God says, wow, this person's ready to be on my team. And who's on his team now? Well, we're pretty sure that Noah, Daniel, and Job are. We think that David will be the king over Israel. Well, there's indication in the Bible for that. And there are other greats that are mentioned in the Bible, both men and women. In Hebrews 11, we sometimes call that the Hall of Fame chapter. Their life is not just over like, well, they lived a nice life, and so here's a record of some of their accomplishments. No, they lived a great life as Christians, and now God wants to magnify what they're doing, bring them back to life, give them people to supervise and direct and teach and help and love and inspire. And then when they are successful with that, give them more people. Expand their responsibilities. Help them to be overseers. It goes on and on. But we have to be work and be fitly framed together. That's the statement over in Ephesians. And I'd like to turn over to Ephesians 4. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11. Okay. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 11. Now these are the gifts that Christ gave to the church. Some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some evangelists, pastors, teachers. Everybody's not expected to do the same exact thing. Everybody's not a yellow pencil in a sense. They all have different responsibilities. Some are very similar and they have overlap, and some are very specific and different. And God says, I want all of these jobs to be held by people that are willing to fulfill the duties of all and make this world a better place. Verse 12, their responsibility is to equip God's people to do his work and to build up the church. in the body of Christ. This will continue until we all come to such unity that our faith, our knowledge of God's sons, that we will be mature in the Lord, measuring up to the full and complete stature of Jesus Christ. So, that's a high calling, and you have to have great unity. Now, I talk about God developing his team. Not everybody has the same job to do. Maybe some will be working with young children primarily, and others with middle-aged children. Okay, so I'm just making a simple point that there is variety, and so one person may match up more naturally with one age bracket than a different age bracket. I remember in Pasadena getting to know this one person. He was a great counselor for, he said, I love counseling young people, teenagers. We get along fantastically well. And he was about 45 years old. He says, the very elderly, I love working with them. People my age, I don't know, it's just not there. I just don't relate to other 45-year-olds, whatever. But my zone is teenagers or the very elderly. And it's not a right or wrong thing, it's just the way things have been. All of you will have very different inclinations. We could do a Strong's-Campbell aptitude test, or have everybody take Myers-Briggs and find out that some people are inclined to be certain way and others a different way. It's not right or wrong, it's just there's variety. And isn't it wonderful that we're not all exactly the same? I wouldn't wish that on anybody. But anyway, there is variety in it. But there are going to be some matches that are better than others. And if you think back in biblical history, let's take the example of the Apostle Paul. Was he an ideal teammate for John Mark? No, at one point he says, that John Mark, let me tell you, we were in the heat of battle, we were in Asia Minor, and he bolted, he took off, he went back to Jerusalem, he left us high and dry, he was going to be our helper. And John Mark probably was saying, I couldn't believe they were living in the shadow of death day after day, and there was absolutely no more glamour left in this, and I had to get out of there. Later on, John Mark, we know, changed his life around, and at the end of his life, the Apostle Paul said, you know what, Timothy, take John Mark with you. He is profitable for the ministry. So Paul had a very good opinion of John Mark at the very end. I believe they could have worked together, or could work together and be a team in the future. But if you were to talk again with the Apostle Paul, who do you think you'd like to have on your team? Oh, give me Silas any day. You know, we worked together. We did a lot. Or I could work with Barnabas. There are just some people that match more naturally with other people, and we tend to work better in our culture than a culture that would be very different. It's not a case of right or wrong. It's just the way life is. So God has to figure out, okay, I've got these people in Vero Beach. Who are they going to best work with? What other people can I add to them in order to make some kind of a dynamic team of people that work together? Because so much collaboration has to be done when you're working with human beings. I'm a marvel of the school system, that one or two special needs people could require a huge amount of time and a lot of consulting back and forth. Well, the manpower will be there to take care of whatever. And we'll have God to be able to consult with. You know, we might go, you might have the experience one day. You say, get an appointment with God the Father. Say, I've worked with this situation, and we could, I think we could get a little more progress than where we are right now. But I'm open to ideas. What do you think? We've looked at the Bible. We've looked at these 10 Bible verses. We seem to all agree. What do you think? how can you help us? Well, of course he could help us. Be willing to. You know, we've got options. We don't have to face the future alone, but we can be heirs together. We can have friends that get along well, that God says, you know, I see they could do a lot more in the future working together, so I'm going to keep them in the same assignments. There are people that have unique proclivities. Winston Churchill was considered a bulldog, and you could say, yeah, he did this right, did this wrong, and so forth. But he was a bulldog, and he didn't get along with everybody. But one person that he did was a very special consultant. His name, he went by the title Lord Marsh. His last name was Marsh. And he was a diminutive person, whereas Churchill was, you know, wanted to have the roar of a lion and have a bulldog mentality. Lord Marsh was very congenial, very accommodating, super intelligent, very patient. He had a lot of the traits that Churchill didn't, but they got along marvelously. And Lord Marsh could always have Churchill's ear and say, sir, I would do this, or I wouldn't do that, or this is my idea, my suggestion. And he got along well with Churchill when other people didn't. So they were known as the bulldog and the sparrow, wherever they went. And they worked well together. Churchill needed somebody with a different personality. Now, opposite personalities most often clash, but in this case, it was just a unique chemistry between the two of them. And there have been other people in the past, in the church, not in the church, that have demonstrated those kind of aspects. And God is looking, who can I match up with who? That's a challenge, not an insurmountable challenge. It's just very important. And then there are times where God will say, and this happens a lot, I see so-and-so. Like I see Peter. Peter is a bull in the china shop. Peter is absolutely right when he said in Luke 5, when Christ called him, follow me, he says, leave me alone, for I'm a sinful man. I believe every word of that. But Christ and God the Father, whom Christ prayed to when he chose his disciples, probably thought, wow, that guy, if he had God's Spirit, if he had repented of his sins, do you know how far he could take himself and other people? He's a natural leader. God knew that, and he wanted him. Satan also knew that. And Christ said, Peter, you know what? The devil has wanted to sift you like wheat, wanted to make mincemeat out of you, or else use you for his own purposes, because you've got some innate ability. You've got to use it correctly. And Christ was patient. 3.5 years into his ministry, Christ was crucified, and Peter, as well as the other disciples, denied Christ. Peter denied him 3 times, just as it was prophesied. And he was mournful, and then he's back and forth. He's sorrowful about his mistakes. And then in John 21, he says, guess what, guys? I can't make heads or tails out of this crucifixion. I thought that Christ was the Messiah. You know what? I'm going fishing. And the others thought, Peter's a natural leader. He knows what he's doing. We're going with you. And so then they couldn't catch anything until Christ told them to move their net to the other side of the boat. And God is a sculptor, and he's a master potter. And he will chisel away at what doesn't belong in our character as he refines us. And he was patient. He didn't see the disciples as a 3.5-year project, and then that's it. And then they're perfect. But he saw them as needing 3.5 years, and they still weren't converted when Christ died. But there were cracks in some of the stubbornness. And Peter finally, after the embarrassment of denying Christ 3 times, and then the embarrassment of saying, I'm going fishing, only to be identified by Christ as one that needed to feed his sheep, not run away. And so Peter was softening up. He might have looked like this ungainly rock that needed to be sculpted out to something beautiful. But that came by the day of Pentecost. Sometimes if you chisel away, take your hammer and you hit the spike or whatever you're using to break off the unnecessary mass of stone, and you have to be careful that you don't hit too hard and just destroy the rock, but hard enough or carefully enough that you break off just the right amount, and maybe it's a large amount. So it's important to not take too much or too little, and it takes time sometimes to chisel away. Somebody said, "What are you doing with your sculpting?" He said, "I've got a block of clay here, and I'm going to make a horse. And the easiest way to do that," he says, "is to remove from the block of clay everything that doesn't look like a horse." That sounds simplistic. But God has to do that with human beings. He's still doing that with us. He chisels away. And then we become more fitly framed together, as we saw in Ephesians 4. Fitly framed together. If we're with people that we sort of get along with, but we don't have a chemistry, that's loosely framed together. But when God knows who the teammates are going to be, and he starts to chisel and he starts to fine-tune everything. And when you fine-tune, especially in building a stone wall or whatever, then all these stones come together tightly, and the structure is infinitely stronger. And God wants to do that with us. He wants to build a team of people, and he chisels away, and he knows what the end result's supposed to look like. So he may match us up with some other people, and maybe we're not the fitly framed group that we could become later, but God doesn't give up on us. Exactly what our future assignments are, I can't tell you. A lot of that just depends on how we respond to God's teaching now. But he wants to work with us. I remember talking to a church member who lived up north. He was a karate expert, jiu-jitsu, karate, aikido, you name it. He knew how the Asian arts, he knew how to, or martial arts, he was very good at. He said, "I used to be such a cocky guy. One of the reasons was I never lost a match in my life. And I ran a studio," he said. And so people would come. He had a reputation all over this huge metropolitan city of being the guy. If you want to really be a great black belt expert, you need to go see him. Anyway, he would win match after match. But as he was getting to his 30s and closing in on age 40, he said, "My body was starting to break down. I took so much abuse because even if I won my match, I would get kicked and pounded and so forth." And he said, "I was so vain, I never showed it. They thought I was invincible." And on one particular day, he said, I wasn't feeling that great, and this one huge guy, looked like he was 6'5", 350 pounds, bench press 500 pounds, looked like the linebacker for the Oakland Raiders or somebody. He wanted a match, and this guy was too vain to say no. "I am the best. I'm the best." So, of course, I take on all comers. So then he met this guy, and then they got into their ring. And before he knew it, the other guy, I guess he'd been waiting for months to meet him, he does this incredible kick and hits this church member in the side of the head. He said, "I was in my defensive three-point stance like this, and whap." He said, "I thought I started seeing stars. My legs got weak. I was ready to tumble, and I caught myself. I don't know how long I was out." He was unconscious. It could have been 2 seconds. It might have been a whole minute. But when I woke up, the guy that had kicked him was on his knees, like, oh, I gave it my best shot, and he didn't go down. Please don't hurt me. Please don't hurt me. He was basically verbalizing that. And this church guy said, if that's the best you got, you might as well leave now. Like, if you gave it your best kick and you couldn't take me down and I didn't even do anything, it's curtains for you. You better leave now, or else you'll face the consequences, face my wrath. Well, the person didn't know how close he was to knocking him out, or maybe he did. But the guy said, that was the last challenge that I accepted. He said, I realized I was a puny human being. He said, God had been chiseling me for 20 years, taking a little bit off, a little bit of braggadocio off with every match as I got sorer and more sore in the years that went by. And then he just took off this one gigantic projection out of me, because God is a sculptor, and he was it's like taking a stone and making it beautiful, and chiseling out all the rough edges, and chiseling out a large bulge that doesn't belong there. And so the end result was a beautiful stone. And so he felt that God had been doing that with him. And even though he was weak at that point in his life, he felt like he was maybe in sync with God more, that God was able to start doing things with him. And it paved the way for reality to set in. Now, God saw Peter as a diamond in the rough. He sees us as diamonds in the rough. He wants to help us, wants to bless us. We have to surrender to God. We have to say, God, it's not my will but yours. Help me. Utilize me. I want to contribute where I can. Help me to do that. When Peter had denied Christ and made different mistakes and said he was going fishing, God had not given up on him. By the time 50 days, 40 days went by, the day of Pentecost, Peter was a dynamic spokesman for God, and he didn't care whether he risked his life or not. He instead of denying Christ, he was embracing Christ. It was quite a testimony. He was a different person, and it was like God had finally gotten that huge projection off of the stone that was Peter and just broke it off. It had probably been cracking for 3.5 years, but then everything clicked. He realized with God's Spirit that he was a leader that could be for good or for bad. So Peter surrendered himself by the day of Pentecost. And it was a tremendous transformation. Now, God carefully monitored Peter after this. He could have said, Christ could have said in John 21, oh, you say you're going fishing? Well, I'm going to blast that to smithereens. How dare you do that? You've been with me for 3.5 years. You denied me 3 times. You did this. You did that. How horrible. He could have taken that approach, but he probably knew that there was a potential cleavage, that maybe all Peter needed was a little gentle persuasion, like taking a small little tap hammer and hitting a little bit more on that rock until a big chunk of it broke off that needed to be expelled. So Peter was, he treated Peter carefully. He didn't say a whole lot. He said, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. And that echoed probably for the next 40 days, until the day of Pentecost occurred. And because this was a few days after Christ's crucifixion. So it was 40 some odd days probably. And so Peter probably thought quite a lot about what Christ had told him, and that was just enough to break off a big chunk of what didn't belong in his life. And he could look back and say, No, that's not me anymore. When you read 2nd and 1st Peter in the Bible, you're reading about a mellow person that has really changed, that is nothing like he used to be. He could be just as dynamic if he needed to be, but he just didn't have the stubborn bullheadedness to go off a cliff. So David understood that God was doing that with him, not right away. When he was told and guaranteed that he would be king, the next thing he knew, King Saul was after him, wanted to put him to death, and he ran for his life, which makes good sense when you have the best fighting force chasing you down under King Saul. That was difficult. And David wrote in one of the Psalms, I believe, but he says, yes, correct me, but don't completely wipe me out. Don't chastise me until I am nothing. So please be merciful. Please be merciful. Well, let me summarize here. We've seen that God has a great deal that he wants to develop mankind to take care of. He could do it by himself, but he shared with mankind. When we study the plan of salvation, what the Holy Days picture, it all boils down to expanding the human race, expanding the responsibility of the saints, expanding our limits in a safe way. When we decide that we want to climb Mount Everest or do something phenomenal or break the world's record in the mile run because we're a spirit being and we can do things like that, sky's the limit. We don't have to risk danger. And God wants us to be around for eternity. We'll have the chance to have great responsibilities helping and directing and guiding other people. That's a wonderful thing. As we do that, we develop more spiritually ourselves, and all of the work that we have is very, very important. And as activity expands through the universe, our responsibilities increase and everything becomes increasingly more important. And do we have the character at that point to hold things together? Bible indicates yes. And some of that strength is by being fitly framed together, working as teams, smaller groups, and then larger groups, and then maybe as nations, and making a huge difference for other people. We need not fear the surveillance system of God. His candid cameras, quote unquote, are throughout the whole earth in a sense, so that he knows how we're doing, that he knows when to help us or step in or show us things that will inspire us to pray for some wisdom. How do I handle this and that? Because God knows if we can eventually handle it, we can handle it 100 more times in the millennium working with other people. So the wonderful thing about the plan of salvation is that it's not busyness. It's not empty activity. It means something. The stakes are high, and all of us are going to be enormously appreciated for being able to help so many people in a way that we can't maybe now, but we'll have the energy, we'll have the wisdom, we'll have the endorsement of God, we'll have the credentials. It'll be a natural development for God to utilize us. So let's be glad for that future. Let's not fear God. Let's seek him while he may be found. And if we're on his candid surveillance cameras, it's all for our good and for the good of the humanity that comes after us.